This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 1, Chapter 3, Mysticism and Psychology. We come now to consider the mental apparatus which is at the disposal of the self, to ask what it can tell us of the method by which she may escape from the prison of the sense world, transcend its rhythm, and attain knowledge of, or conscious contact with, a suprasensible reality. We have seen the normal self shut within that prison and making, by the help of science and of philosophy, a survey of the premises and furniture, testing the thickness of the walls and speculating on the possibility of trustworthy news from without penetrating to her cell. Shut with her in that cell, two forces, the desire to know more and the desire to love more, are ceaselessly at work. Where the first of these cravings predominates, we call the result a philosophical or a scientific temperament. Where it is overpowered by the ardour of unsatisfied love, the self's reaction upon things becomes poetic, artistic, and characteristically, though not always explicitly, religious. We have seen further that a certain number of persons declare that they have escaped from the prison. Have they done so, it can only be in order to satisfy these two hungry desires, for these and these only make that a prison which might otherwise be a comfortable hotel. And since in varying degrees these desires are in all of us, active or latent, it is clearly worthwhile to discover, if we can, the weak point in the walls and method of achieving this one possible way of escape. Before we try to define in psychological language the way in which the mystic slips the fetters of sense, sets out upon his journey towards home, it seems well to examine the machinery which is at the disposal of the normal, conscious self, the creature, or part of a creature, which we recognize as ourselves. The older psychologists were accustomed to say that the messages from the outer world awaken in that self three main forms of activity. 1. They arouse movements of attraction or repulsion, of desire or distaste, which vary in intensity from the semi-conscious cravings of the hungry infant to the passions of the lover, artist or fanatic. 2. They stimulate a sort of digestive process in which she combines and cogitates upon the material presented to her, finally absorbing a certain number of the resulting concepts and making them part of herself or of her world. 3. The movements of desire or the action of reason, or both in varying combinations, awaken in her determination by which percepts and concepts issue in action, bodily, mental, or spiritual. Hence, the main aspects of the self were classified as emotion, intellect, and will, and the individual temperament was regarded as emotional, intellectual, or volitional according to whether feeling, thought, or will assumed the reins. Modern psychologists have moved away from this diagrammatic conception and incline more and more to dwell upon the unity of the psyche, that hypothetical self which none have ever seen, and on some aspect of its energetic desire, its libido or hormic drive, as the ruling factor of its life. These conceptions are useful to the student of mysticism, though they cannot be accepted uncritically or regarded as complete. Now, the unsatisfied psyche in her emotional aspect wants, as we have said, to love more. Her curious intellect wants to know more. The awakened human creature suspects that both appetites are being kept on a low diet, that there really is more to love and more to know, somewhere in the mysterious world without, and further, that its powers of affection and understanding are worthy of some greater and more durable objective than that provided by the illusions of sense. Urged therefore by the cravings of feeling or of thought, consciousness is always trying to run out to the encounter of the Absolute, and always being forced to return. The neat philosophical system, the diagrams of science, the sunset touch, are tried in turn. Art and life, the accidents of our humanity, may foster an emotional outlook, till the moment in which the neglected intellect arises and pronounces such an outlook to have no validity. Metaphysics and science seem to offer to the intellect an open window towards truth, till the heart looks out and declares this landscape to be a chill desert in which she can find no nourishment. These diverse aspects of things must be either fused or transcended if the whole self is to be satisfied, for the reality which she seeks has got to meet both claims and pay in full. When Dionysius the Areopagite divided those angels who stand nearest to God into the seraphs who are aflame with perfect love, and the cherubs who are filled with perfect knowledge, he only gave expression to the two most intense aspirations of the human soul, and described under an image the twofold condition of that beatific vision which is her goal. There is a sense in which it may be said that the desire of knowledge is a part of the desire of perfect love, since one aspect of that all-inclusive passion is clearly a longing to know, in the deepest, fullest, closest sense, the thing adored. Love's characteristic activity, for love always is inherently active and cannot be lazy, as the mystics say, is a quest, an outgoing towards an object desired, which only when possessed will be fully known, and only when fully known can be perfectly adored. Intimate communion, no less than worship, is of its essence. Joyous fruition is its proper end. This is true of all love's quest, whether the beloved be human or divine, the bride, the grail, the mystic rose, the plenitude of God. But there is no sense in which it can be said that the desire of love is merely a part of the desire of perfect knowledge. For that strictly intellectual ambition includes no adoration, no self-spending, no reciprocity of feeling between knower and known. Mere knowledge taken alone is a matter of receiving, not of acting, of eyes, not wings, a dead-alive business at the best. There is thus a sharp distinction to be drawn between these two great expressions of life, the energetic love, the passive knowledge. One is related to the eager, outgoing activity, the dynamic impulse to do somewhat, physical, mental, or spiritual, which is inherent in all living things and which psychologists call conation. The other to the indwelling consciousness, the passive knowing somewhat, which they call cognition. Now, conation is almost wholly the business of will, but of will stimulated by emotion. For willful action of every kind, however intellectual it may seem, is always the result of interest, and interest involves feeling. We act because we feel we want to, feel we must. Whether the inspiring force be a mere preference or an overwhelming urge, our impulse to do is a synthesis of determination and desire. All man's achievements are the result of conation, never of mere thought. The intellect by itself moves nothing, said Aristotle, and modern psychology has but affirmed this law. Hence his quest of reality is never caused, though it may be greatly assisted, by the intellectual aspect of his consciousness. For the reasoning powers as such have little initiative. Their province is analytic, not exploratory. They stay at home, dissecting and arranging matter that comes to hand, and do not adventure beyond their own region in search of food. Thought does not penetrate far into an object in which the self feels no interest, i.e., towards which it does not experience a conative movement of attraction, of desire. For interest is the only method known to us of arousing the will, and securing the fixity of attention necessary to any intellectual process. None think for long about anything for which they do not care, that is to say, which does not touch some aspect of their emotional life. They may hate it, love it, fear it, want it, but they must have some feeling about it. Feeling is the tentacle we stretch out to the world of things. Here the lesson of psychology is the same as that which Dante brought back from his pilgrimage, the supreme importance and harmonious movement of il desiro and il vele, si come rota che guellamente el mosa. These move together to fulfill the cosmic plan. In all human life, insofar as it is not merely a condition of passive awareness, the law which he found implicit in the universe is the law of the individual mind, not logic, not common sense, but l'amor che move il sole e le altre stelle, the motive force of the spirit of man, in the inventors, the philosophers, and the artists, no less than in the heroes and in the saints. The vindication of the importance of feeling in our life, and in particular, its primacy over reason in all that has to do with man's contact with the transcendental world, has been one of the great achievements of modern psychology. In the sphere of religion, it is now acknowledged that God, known of the heart, gives a better account of the character of our spiritual experience than God guessed at by the brain. That the loving intuition is more fruitful and more trustworthy than the dialectic proof. One by one, the commonplaces of mysticism are thus rediscovered by official science and given their proper place in the psychology of the spiritual life. Thus Luba, hardly a friendly witness, is found to agree with the fourth evangelist that life, a larger, richer, more satisfying life, is in the last analysis the end of religion. And we have seen that life, as we know it, has the character of a purposive striving, more directly dependent on will and feeling than on thought. Of this drive, this urge, thought indeed is but the servant, a skilled and often arrogant servant, with a constant tendency to usurpation. Some form of feeling, interest, desire, fear, appetite, must supply the motive power. Without this, the will would be dormant and the intellect lapse into a calculating machine. Further, the heart has its reasons which the mind knows not of. It is a matter of experience that in our moments of deep emotion, transitory though they be, we plunge deeper into the reality of things than we can hope to do in hours of the most brilliant argument. At the touch of passion, doors fly open which logic has battered on in vain. For passion rouses to activity not merely the mind, but the whole vitality of man. It is the lover, the poet, the mourner, the convert, who shares for a moment the mystic's privilege of lifting that veil of Isis which science handles so helplessly, leaving only her dirty finger marks behind. The heart, eager and restless, goes out into the unknown and brings home, literally and actually, fresh food for thought. Hence those who feel to think are likely to possess a richer, more real, if less orderly, experience than those who think to feel. This psychological law, easily proved in regard to earthly matters, holds good also upon the supersensual plane. It was expressed once for all by the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, when he said of God, "By love he may be gotten and holden, but by thought of understanding never." That exalted feeling, that secret blind love pressing, not the neat deductions of logic, the apologist proofs of the existence of the Absolute, unseals the eyes to things unseen before. Therefore, says the same mystic, what time that thou purposest thee to this work, and feelest by grace that thou art called of God, lift then up thine heart unto God with a meek stirring of love, and mean God that made thee and bought thee, and that graciously hath called thee to thy degree and received none other thought of God. And yet not all these, but if thou list, for it sufficeth thee enough, a naked intent direct unto God, without any other cause than himself. Here we see emotion at its proper work, the movement of desire passing over at once into the act of concentration, the gathering up of all the powers of the self into a state of determined attention, which is the business of the will. This driving and drawing, says Rusborough, we feel in the heart and in the unity of all our bodily powers, and especially in the desirous powers. This act of perfect concentration, the passionate focusing of the self upon one point when it is applied with a naked intent to real and transcendental things, constitutes in the technical language of mysticism the state of recollection, a condition which is peculiarly characteristic of the mystical consciousness and is the necessary prelude of pure contemplation, that state in which the mystic enters into communion with reality. We have then arrived so far in our description of the mechanism of the mystic. Possessed like other men of powers of feeling, thought, and will, it is essential that his love and his determination, even more than his thought, should be set upon transcendent reality. He must feel a strong emotional attraction toward the supercentral object of his quest, that love which scholastic philosophy defined as the force or power which causes every creature to follow out the trend of its own nature. Of this must be born the will to attain communion with that absolute object. This will, this burning and active desire, must crystallize into and express itself by that definite and conscious concentration of the whole self upon the object which precedes the contemplative state. We see already how far astray are those who look upon the mystical temperament as passive in type. Our next concern, then, would seem to be with this condition of contemplation, what it does and whither it leads. What is A, its psychological explanation, and B, its empirical value? Now, in dealing with this and other rare mental conditions, we are, of course, trying to describe from without that which can only adequately be described from within, which is as much as to say that only mystics can really write about mysticism. Fortunately, many mystics have so written, and we, from their experiences and from the explorations of psychology upon another plane, are able to make certain elementary deductions. It appears generally from these that the act of contemplation is for the mystic a psychic gateway, a method of growing from one level of consciousness to another. In technical language, it is the condition under which he shifts his field of perception and obtains his characteristic outlook on the universe. That there is such a characteristic outlook, peculiar to no creed or race, is proved by the history of mysticism, which demonstrates plainly enough that in some men another sort of consciousness, another sense, may be liberated beyond the normal powers we have discussed. This sense has attachments at each point to emotion, to intellect, and to will. It can express itself under each of the aspects which these terms connote, yet it differs from and transcends the emotional, intellectual, and volitional life of ordinary men. It was recognized by Plato as that consciousness which could apprehend the real world of the ideas. Its development is the final object of that education which his Republic describes. It is called by Plotinus another intellect different from that which reasons and is denominated rational. Its business, he says, is the perception of the supersensual, or in Neoplatonic language, the intelligible world. It is the sense which, in the words of the Theologica Germanica, has the power of seeing into eternity, the mysterious eye of the soul by which St. Augustine saw the light that never changes. It is, says Al-Ghazali, a Persian mystic of the 11th century, like an immediate perception, as if one touched its object with one's hand. In the words of his great Christian successor, St. Bernard, it may be defined as the soul's true unerring intuition, the unhesitating apprehension of truth, which simple vision of truth, says St. Thomas Aquinas, ends in a movement of desire. It is infused with burning love, for it seems to its possessors to be primarily a movement of the heart, with intellectual subtlety, for its ardour is wholly spent upon the most sublime object of thought, with unflinching will, for its adventures are undertaken in the teeth of the natural doubts, prejudices, languors, and self-indulgence of man. These adventures, looked upon by those who stay at home as a form of the higher laziness, are in reality the last and most arduous labours which the human spirit is called to perform. They are the only known method by which we can come into conscious possession of all our powers, and, rising from the lower to the higher levels of consciousness, become aware of that larger life in which we are immersed, attain communion with the transcendent personality in whom that life is resumed. Mary has chosen the better, not the idler part, for her gaze is directed towards those first principles, without which the activity of Martha would have no meaning at all. In vain does sardonic common sense, confronted with the contemplative type, reiterate the sneer of Mucius. Encore sont-ils heureux que la pauvre Marthe leur fasse la cuisine. It remains a paradox of the mystics that the passivity at which they appear to aim is really a state of the most intense activity. More, that where it is wholly absent, no great creative action can take place. In it, the superficial self compels itself to be still, in order that it may liberate another, more deep-seated power which is, in the ecstasy of the contemplative genius, raised to the highest pitch of efficiency. This restful travail, said Walter Hilton, is full far from fleshly idleness and from blind security. It is full of ghostly work, but it is called rest. For grace looseth the heavy yoke of fleshly love from the soul, and maketh it mighty and free through the gift of the holy ghostly love for to work gladly, softly, and delectably. Therefore is it called an holy idleness, and a rest most busy. And so is it in stillness, from the great crying and the beastly noise of fleshly desires. If those who have cultivated this latent power be correct in their statements, the self was mistaken in supposing herself to be entirely shut off from the true external universe. She has, it seems, certain tentacles which, once she learns to uncurl them, will stretch sensitive fingers far beyond that limiting envelope in which her normal consciousness is contained, and give her news of a higher reality than that which can be deduced from the reports of the senses. The fully developed and completely conscious human soul can open as an anemone does, and know the ocean in which she is bathed. This act, this condition of consciousness, in which barriers are obliterated, the Absolute flows in on us, and we, rushing out to its embrace, find and feel the infinite above all reason and above all knowledge, is the true mystical state. The value of contemplation is that it tends to produce this state, release this transcendental sense, and so turns the lower servitude in which the natural man lives under the sway of his earthly environment to the higher servitude of fully conscious dependence on that reality in whom we live and move and have our being. What then, we ask, is the nature of this special sense, this transcendental consciousness, and how does contemplation liberate it? Any attempt to answer this question brings upon the scene another aspect of man's psychic life, an aspect of paramount importance to the student of the mystic type. We have reviewed the chief ways in which our surface consciousness reacts upon experience, a surface consciousness which has been trained through long ages to deal with the universe of sense. We know, however, that the personality of man is a far deeper and more mysterious thing than the sum of his conscious feeling, thought, and will. That this superficial self, this ego of which each of us is aware, hardly counts in comparison with the deeps of being which it hides. There is a root or depth in thee, says law, from whence all these faculties come forth as lines from a center, or as branches from the body of a tree. This depth is called the center, the fund or bottom of the soul. This depth is the unity, the eternity, I had almost said the infinity of thy soul, for it is so infinite that nothing can satisfy it or give it any rest but the infinity of God. Since normal man is utterly unable to set up relations with spiritual reality by means of his feeling, thought, and will, it is clearly in this depth of being, in these unplumbed levels of personality, that we must search if we would find the organ, the power, by which he is to achieve the mystic quest. That alteration of consciousness which takes place in contemplation can only mean the emergence from this fund or bottom of the soul of some faculty which diurnal life keeps hidden in the deeps. Modern psychology, in its doctrine of the unconscious or subliminal personality, has acknowledged this fact of a range of psychic life lying below and beyond the conscious field. Indeed, it has so dwelt upon and defined this shadowy region, which is really less a region than a useful name, that it sometimes seems to know more about the unconscious than about the conscious life of man. There it finds, side by side, the sources of his most animal instincts, his least explicable powers, his most spiritual intuitions, the ape and tiger, and the soul. Genius and prophecy, insomnia and infatuation, clairvoyance, hypnotism, hysteria, and Christian Science are all explained by the unconscious mind. In his destructive moods, the psychologist has little apparent difficulty in reducing the chief phenomena of religions and mystical experience to activities of the unconscious, seeking an oblique satisfaction of repressed desires. Where he undertakes the more dangerous duties of apologetic, he explains the same phenomena by saying that God speaks to man in the subconscious, by which he can only mean that our apprehensions of the eternal have the character of intuition rather than of thought. Yet the unconscious, after all, is merely a convenient name for the aggregate of those powers, parts, or qualities of the whole self which at any given moment are not conscious, or that the ego is not conscious of. Included in the unconscious region of an average healthy man are all those automatic activities by which the life of the body is carried on, all those uncivilized instincts and vices, those remains of the ancestral savage, which education has forced out of the stream of consciousness, and which now only send their messages to the surface in a carefully disguised form. There too work in the hiddenness those longings for which the busy life of the world leaves no place. And there lies that deep pool, that heart of personality, from which in moments of lucidity a message may reach the conscious field. Hence in normal men the best and worst, most savage and most spiritual parts of character are bottled up below the threshold. Often the partisans of the unconscious forget to mention this. It follows then that whilst we may find it convenient and indeed necessary to avail ourselves of the symbols and diagrams of psychology in tracking out the mystic way, we must not forget the large and vague significance which attaches to these symbols and the hypothetical character of many of the entities they represent. Nor must we allow ourselves to use the unconscious as the equivalent of man's transcendental sense. Here the mystics have surely displayed a more scientific spirit, a more delicate power of analysis than the psychologists. They, too, were aware that in normal men, the spiritual sense lies below the threshold of consciousness. Though they had not at their command the spatial metaphors of the modern school, and could not describe man's ascent toward God in those picturesque terms of levels and uprushes, margins and fields, projection, repression, and sublimation, which now come so naturally to investigators of the spiritual life. They leave us in no doubt as to their view of the facts. Further, man's spiritual history primarily meant for them, as it means for us, the emergence of this transcendental sense, its capture of the field of consciousness, and the opening up of those paths which permit the inflow of a larger spiritual life, the perception of a higher reality. This, insofar as it was an isolated act, was contemplation. When it was part of the general life process and had permanent results, they called it the new birth, which maketh alive. The faculty or personality concerned in the new birth, the spiritual man, capable of the spiritual vision and life, which was dissociated from the earthly man, adapted only to the natural life, was always sharply distinguished by them from the total personality, conscious or unconscious. It was something definite, a bit or spot of man which, belonging not to time but to eternity, was different in kind from the rest of his human nature, framed in all respects to meet the demands of the merely natural world. The business of the mystic in the eyes of these old specialists was to remake, transmute his total personality in the interest of his spiritual self, to bring it out of the hiddenness and unify himself about it as a center, thus putting on divine humanity. The divine nucleus, the point of contact between man's life and the divine life in which it is immersed and sustained, has been given many names in course of the development of mystical doctrine. All clearly mean the same thing, though emphasizing different aspects of its life. Sometimes it is called the synteresis, the keeper or preserver of his being. Sometimes the spark of the soul, the Funklin of the German mystics. Sometimes its apex, the point at which it touches the heavens. Then, with a sudden flight to the other end of the symbolic scale, and in order to emphasize its participation in pure being, rather than its difference from mere nature, it is called the ground of the soul, the foundation or basal stuff indwelt by God, whence springs all spiritual life. Clearly all these guesses and suggestions aim at one goal, and are all to be understood in a symbolic sense. For, as Malavel observed in answer to his disciples' anxious inquiries on this subject, since the soul of man is a spiritual thing, and thus cannot have divisions or parts, consequently, it cannot have height or depth, summit or surface. But because we judge spiritual things by the help of material things, since we know these better and they are more familiar to us, we call the highest of all forms of conception the summit, and the easier way of comprehending things the surface of the understanding. Here, at any rate, whatever name we may choose to give it, is the organ of man's spiritual consciousness, the place where he meets the absolute, the germ of his real life. Here is the seat of that deep transcendental feeling, the beginning and end of metaphysics, which is, says Professor Stewart, at once the solemn sense of timeless being, of that which was and is and ever shall be, overshadowing us, and the conviction that life is good. I hold, says the same writer, that it is in transcendental feeling, manifested normally as faith in the value of life, and ecstatically as sense of timeless being, and not in thought proceeding by way of speculative construction, that consciousness comes nearest to the object of metaphysics, ultimate reality. The existence of such a sense, such an integral part or function of the complete human being, has been affirmed and dwelt upon not only by the mystics, but by seers and teachers of all times and creeds, by Egypt, Greece, and India, the poets, the fakirs, the philosophers, and the saints. A belief in its actuality is the pivot of the Christian position, indeed of every religion worthy of the name. It is the justification of mysticism, asceticism, the whole machinery of the self-renouncing life. That there is an extreme point at which man's nature touches the absolute, that his ground or substance, his true being, is penetrated by the divine life which constitutes the underlying reality of things. This is the basis on which the whole mystic claim of possible union with God must rest. Here, they say, is our link with reality, and in this place alone can be celebrated the marriage from which the Lord comes. To use another of the diagrams, it is thanks to the existence within him of this immortal spark from the central fire that man is implicitly a child of the infinite. The mystic way must therefore be a life, a discipline, which will so alter the constituents of his mental life as to include this spark within the conscious field, bring it out of the hiddenness, from those deep levels where it sustains and guides his normal existence, and make it the dominant element round which his personality is arranged. End of the first half of Part 1, Chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. Second half of Part 1, Chapter 3. It is clear that under ordinary conditions, and save for sudden gusts of transcendental feeling induced by some saving madness such as religion, art, or love, the superficial self knows nothing of the attitude of this silent watcher, this dweller in the innermost, towards the incoming messages of the external world, nor of the activities which they awaken it. Concentrated on the sense world and the messages she receives from it, she knows nothing of the relations which exist between this subject and the unattainable object of all thought. But by a deliberate inattention to the messages of the senses, such as that which is induced by contemplation, the mystic can bring the ground of the soul, the seat of transcendental feeling, within the area of consciousness, making it amenable to the activity of the will, thus becoming unaware of his usual and largely fictitious external world, another and more substantial set of perceptions, which never have their chance under normal conditions, rise to the surface. Sometimes these unite with normal reasoning faculties. More often they supersede them. Some such exchange, such losing to find, appears to be necessary if man's transcendental powers are to have their full chance. The two eyes of the soul of man, says the Theologia Germanica, here developing a profound Platonic image, cannot both perform their work at once. But if the soul shall see with the right eye into eternity, then the left eye must close itself and refrain from working, and be as though it were dead. For if the left eye be fulfilling its office toward outward things, that is, holding converse with time and the creatures, then must the right eye be hindered in its working, that is, in its contemplation. Therefore, whosoever will have the one must let the other go, for no man can serve two masters. There is within us an immense capacity for perception, for the receiving of messages from outside, and a very little consciousness which deals with them. It is as if one telegraph operator were placed in charge of a multitude of lines. All may be in action, but he can only attend to one at a time. In popular language, there is not enough consciousness to go round. Even upon the central plane, no one can be aware of more than a few things at once. These fill the center of our field of consciousness, as the object on which we happen to have focused our vision dominates our field of sight. The other matters within that field retreat to the margin. We know dimly that they are there, but we pay them no attention, and should hardly miss them if they cease to exist. Transcendental matters are, for most of us, always beyond the margin, because most of us have given up our whole consciousness to the occupation of the senses, and permitted them to construct there a universe in which we are contented to remain. Only in certain states, recollection, contemplation, ecstasy and their allied conditions, does the self contrive to turn out the usual tenants, shut the gateways of the flesh, and let those submerged powers which are capable of picking up messages from another plane of being have their turn. Then it is the sense world which retreats beyond the margin, and another landscape that rushes in. At last, then, we begin to see something of what contemplation does for its initiates. It is one of the many names applied to that chain of processes which have for their object this alteration of the mental equilibrium, the putting to sleep of that normal self which usually wakes, and the awakening of that transcendental self which usually sleeps. To man, meeting point of various stages of reality, is given, though he seldom considers it, this unique power of choosing his universe. The phenomenon known as double or disintegrated personality may perhaps give us a hint as to the mechanical nature of the change which contemplation effects. In this psychic malady, the total character of the patient is split up. A certain group of qualities are, as it were, abstracted from the surface consciousness, and so closely associated as to form in themselves a complete character or personality, necessarily poles asunder from the character which the self usually shows to the world, since it consists exclusively of those elements which are omitted from it. Thus, in the classical case of Miss Beauchamp, the investigator Dr. Morton Prince called the three chief personalities, from their ruling characteristics, the saint, the woman, and the devil. The totality of character which composed the real Miss Beauchamp had split up into these contrasting types, each of which was excessive, because withdrawn from the control of the rest. When, voluntarily or involuntarily, the personality which had possession of the field of consciousness was lulled to sleep, one of the others emerged. Hypnotism was one of the means which most easily effected this change. Now, in persons of mystical genius, the qualities which the stress of normal life tends to keep below the threshold of consciousness are of enormous strength. In these natural explorers of eternity, the transcendental faculty, the eye of the soul, is not merely present in embryo, but is highly developed, and is combined with great emotional and volitional power. The result of the segregation of such qualities below the threshold of consciousness is to remove from them the friction of those counterbalancing traits in the surface mind with which they might collide. They are in the hiddenness, as Jacob Boehm would say. There they develop unchecked, until a point is reached at which their strength is such that they break their bounds and emerge into the conscious field, either temporarily dominating the subject as in ecstasy, or permanently transmuting the old self, as in the unitive life. The attainment of this point may be accelerated by processes which have always been known and valued by the mystics, and which tend to produce a state of consciousness classed by psychologists with dreams, reverie, and the results of hypnosis. In all these, the normal surface consciousness is deliberately or involuntarily lulled. The images and ideas connected with normal life are excluded, and images or faculties from beyond the threshold are able to take their place. Of course, these images or faculties may or may not be more valuable than those already present in the surface consciousness. In the ordinary subject, often enough, they are but the odds and ends for which the superficial mind has found no use. In the mystic, they are of a very different order, and this fact justifies the means which he instinctively employs to secure their emergence. Indian mysticism founds its external system almost wholly on A. asceticism, the domination of the senses, and B. the deliberate practice of self-hypnotization, either by fixing the eyes on a near object or by the rhythmic repetition of the mantra or sacred word. By these complementary forms of discipline, the pool of the phenomenal world is diminished, and the mind is placed at the disposal of the subconscious powers. Dancing, music, and other exaggerations of natural rhythm have been pressed into the same service by the Greek initiates of Dionysus, by the Gnostics, by innumerable other mystic cults. That these proceedings do effect a remarkable change in the human consciousness is proved by experience, though how and why they do it is as yet little understood. Such artificial and deliberate production of ecstasy is against the whole instinct of the Christian contemplatives. But here and there amongst them also we find instances in which ecstatic trance or lucidity, the liberation of the transcendental sense, was inadvertently produced by purely physical means. Thus Jacob Boehm, the Teutonic theosopher, having one day as he sat in his room, gazed fixedly upon a burnished pewter dish which reflected the sunshine with great brilliance, fell into an inward ecstasy, and it seemed to him as if he could look into the principles and deepest foundations of things. The contemplation of running water had the same effect on St. Ignatius Loyola. Sitting on the bank of a river one day and facing the stream, which was running deep, the eyes of his mind were opened, not so as to see any kind of vision, but so as to understand and comprehend spiritual things, and this with such clearness that for him all these things were made new. This method of attaining to mental lucidity by a narrowing and simplification of the conscious field finds an apt parallel in the practice of Immanuel Kant, who found that he could better engage in philosophical thought while gazing steadily at a neighbouring church steeple. It need hardly be said that rationalistic writers, ignoring the parallels offered by the artistic and philosophic temperaments, have seized eagerly upon the evidence afforded by such instances of apparent monoideism and self-hypnotization in the lives of the mystics, and by the physical disturbances which accompany the ecstatic trance, and sought by its application to attribute all the abnormal perceptions of contemplative genius to hysteria or other disease. They have not hesitated to call St. Paul an epileptic, St. Teresa the patron saint of hysterics, and have found room for most of their spiritual kindred in various departments of the pathological museum. They have been helped in this grateful task by the acknowledged fact that the great contemplatives, though almost always persons of robust intelligence and marked practical or intellectual ability, Plotinus, St. Bernard, the two Saints Catherine, St. Teresa, St. John of the Cross, and the Sufi poets Jami and Jalaluddin are cases in point, have often suffered from bad physical health. More, their mystical activities have generally reacted upon their bodies in a definite and special way, producing in several cases a particular kind of illness and of physical disability, accompanied by pains and functional disturbances for which no organic cause could be discovered, unless that cause were the immense strain which exalted spirit puts upon a body which is adapted to a very different form of life. It is certain that the abnormal and highly sensitized type of mind, which we call mystical, does frequently, but not always, produce or accompany strange and inexplicable modifications of the physical organism with which it is linked. The supernatural is not here in question, except insofar as we are inclined to give that name to natural phenomena which we do not understand. Such instances of psychophysical parallelism as the stigmatizations of the saints, and indeed of other suggestible subjects hardly to be ranked as saints, will occur to anyone. I here offer to the reader another, less discussed and more extraordinary example of the modifying influence of the spirit on the supposed laws of bodily life. We know as a historical fact, unusually well attested by contemporary evidence and quite outside the sphere of hagiographic romance, that both St. Catherine of Siena and her namesake, St. Catherine of Genoa, active women as well as ecstatics, the first a philanthropist, reformer and politician, the second an original theologian, and for many years the highly efficient matron of a large hospital, lived in the first case for years, in the second for constantly repeated periods of many weeks, without other food than the consecrated host which they received at Holy Communion. They did this not by way of difficult obedience to a pious vow, but because they could not live in any other way. Whilst fasting, they were well and active, capable of dealing with the innumerable responsibilities which filled their lives. But the attempt to eat even a few mouthfuls, and this attempt was constantly repeated, for, like all true saints, they detested eccentricity, at once made them ill and had to be abandoned as useless. In spite of the researches of Muricier, Janet, Ribot, and other psychologists, and their persevering attempts to find a pathological explanation which will fit all mystic facts, this and other marked physical peculiarities which accompany the mystical temperament belong as yet to the unsolved problems of humanity. They need to be removed both from the sphere of marvel and from that of disease, into which enthusiastic friends and foes force them by turn, to the sphere of pure psychology, and there studied dispassionately, with the attention which we so willingly bestow on the less interesting eccentricities of degeneracy and vice. Their existence no more discredits the sanity of mysticism or the validity of its results, than the unstable nervous condition usually noticed in artists, who share to some extent the mystic's apprehension of the real, discredits art. In such cases as Kant and Beethoven, says von Hugel justly, a classifier of humanity according to its psychophysical phenomena alone would put these great discoverers and creators, without hesitation, amongst hopeless and useless hypochondriacs. In the case of the mystics, the disease of hysteria, with its astounding variety of mental symptoms, its strange power of disintegrating, rearranging, and enhancing the elements of consciousness, its tendencies to automatism and ecstasy, have been most often invoked to provide an explanation of the observed phenomena. This is as if one sought the source of the genius of Taglioni in the symptoms of St. Vitus's dance. Both the art and the disease have to do with bodily movements. So too, both mysticism and hysteria have to do with the domination of consciousness by one fixed and intense idea or intuition, which rules the life and is able to produce amazing physical and psychical results. In the hysteric patient, this idea is often trivial or morbid, but has become, thanks to the self's unstable mental condition, an obsession. In the mystic, the dominant idea is a great one, so great in fact that when it is received in its completeness by the human consciousness, almost of necessity, it outs all else. It is nothing less than the idea or perception of the transcendent reality and presence of God. Hence the monoideism of the mystic is rational, whilst that of the hysteric patient is invariably irrational. On the whole, then, whilst psychophysical relations remain so little understood, it would seem more prudent, and certainly more scientific, to withhold our judgment on the meaning of the psychophysical phenomena which accompany the mystic life, instead of basing destructive criticism on facts which are avowedly mysterious and at least capable of more than one interpretation. To deduce the nature of a compound from the character of its byproducts is notoriously unsafe. Our bodies are animal things, made for animal activities. When a spirit of unusual ardor insists on using its nerve cells for other activities, they kick against the pricks, and inflict, as the mystics themselves acknowledge, the penalty of mystical ill health. Believe me, children, says Tola, one who would know much about these high matters would often have to keep his bed, for his bodily frame could not support it. I cause thee extreme pain of body, says the voice of love to Mechthild of Magdeburg. If I gave myself to thee as often as thou wouldst have me, I should deprive myself of the sweet shelter I have of thee in this world, for 1,000 bodies could not protect a loving soul from her desire. Therefore the higher the love, the greater the pain. On the other hand, the exalted personality of the mystic, his self-discipline, his heroic acceptance of labor and suffering, and his inflexible will, raises to a higher term that normal power of mind over body which all possess. Also, the contemplative state, like the hypnotic state of a healthy person, seems to enhance life by throwing open deeper levels of mentality. The self then drinks the fountain displayed by the universe. True ecstasy is notorious in life. The bracing contact with reality seems to take place, and as a result, the subject is himself more real. Often, says Saint Teresa, even the sick come forth from ecstasy healthy and with new strength, for something great is then given to the soul. Contact has been set up with levels of being which the daily routine of existence moves uncovered. Hence the extraordinary powers of endurance and independence of external stimulus, which the great acceptance so often removes. If we see in this case, as some have done, the sporadic beginning of a power, a higher consciousness, towards which the great slowly turns, then it seems likely enough that where it appears, nerves and organs should suffer under a stress to which they have not yet become adapted, and that a spirit more highly organized than its bodily home should be able to impose strange conditions on the flesh. When man first stood upright, a body long accustomed to go on all fours, legs which had adjusted themselves to bearing but half his weight, must have rebelled against this unnatural proceeding, inflicting upon its author much pain and discomfort, if not absolute illness. It is at least permissible to look upon the strange psychophysical state common amongst the mystics as just such a rebellion on the part of a normal nervous and vascular system against the exigencies of a way of life to which it has not yet adjusted itself. In spite of such rebellion, and of the tortures to which it has subjected them, the mystics, oddly enough, are a long-lived race, an awkward fact for critics of the physiological school. To take only a few instances from amongst marked ecstatics, Saint Hildegard lived to be 81, Mechthild of Magdeburg to 87, Ruysbroek to 88, Suso to 70, Saint Teresa to 67, Saint Catherine of Genoa, and Saint Peter of Alcantara to 63. It seems as though that enhanced life, which is the reward of mystical surrender, enabled them to triumph over their bodily disabilities, and to live and do the work demanded of them under conditions which would have incapacitated ordinary men. Such triumphs, which take heroic rank in the history of the human mind, have been accomplished as a rule in the same way. Like all intuitive persons, all possessors of genius, all potential artists, with whom in fact they are closely related, the mystics have, in psychological language, thresholds of exceptional mobility. That is to say, a slight effort, a slight departure from normal conditions, will permit their latent or subliminal powers to emerge and occupy the mental field. A mobile threshold may make a man a genius, a lunatic, or a saint. All depends upon the character of the emerging powers. In the great mystic, these powers, these tracts of personality lying below the level of normal consciousness, are of unusual richness, and cannot be accounted for in terms of pathology. If it be true, says Delacroix, that the great mystics have not wholly escaped those nervous blemishes which mark nearly all exceptional organizations, there is in them a vital and creative power, a constructive logic, an extended scale of realization, in a word, a genius, which is, in truth, their essential quality. The great mystics, creators and inventors, who have found a new form of life and have justified it, join, upon the highest summits of the human spirit, the great simplifiers of the world. The truth, then, so far as we know it at present, seems to be that those powers which are in contact with the transcendental order, and which constitute at the lowest estimate half the self, are dormant in ordinary men, whose time and interest are wholly occupied in responding to the stimuli of the world of sense. With those latent powers sleeps the landscape which they alone can apprehend. In mystics, none of the self is always dormant. They have roused the dweller in the innermost from its slumbers, and round it have unified their life. Heart, reason, will are there in full action, drawing their incentive not from the shadow show of sense, but from the deeps of true being, where a lamp is lit, and a consciousness awake, of which the sleepy crowd remains oblivious. He who says the mystic is but half a man states the exact opposite of the truth. Only the mystic can be called a whole man, since in others half the powers of the self always sleep. This wholeness of experience is much insisted on by the mystics. Thus the divine voice says to Saint Catherine of Siena, "I have also shown thee the bridge and the 3 general steps placed there for the 3 powers of the soul. And I have told thee how no one can attain to the life of grace unless he has mounted all 3 steps. That is, gathered together all the 3 powers of the soul in my name." In those abnormal types of personality to which we give the name of genius, we seem to detect a hint of the relations which may exist between these deep levels of being and the crust of consciousness. In the poet, the musician, the great mathematician or inventor, powers lying below the threshold, and hardly controllable by their owner's conscious will, clearly take a major part in the business of perception and conception. In all creative acts, the larger share of the work is done subconsciously. Its emergence is in a sense automatic. This is equally true of mystics, artists, philosophers, discoverers, and rulers of men. The great religion, invention, work of art always owes its inception to some sudden uprush of intuitions or ideas for which the superficial self cannot account. Its execution to powers so far beyond the control of that self that they seem, as their owner sometimes says, to come from beyond. This is inspiration, the opening of the sluices, so that those waters of truth in which all life is bathed may rise to the level of consciousness. The great teacher, poet, artist, inventor never aims deliberately at his effects. He obtains that he knows not how, perhaps from a contact of which he is unconscious with that creative plane of being which the Sufis call the constructive spirit, and the Kabbalists Yesod, and which both postulate as lying next behind the world of sense. Sometimes, said the great Alexandrian Jew Philo, when I have come to my work empty, I have suddenly become full, ideas being in an invisible manner showered upon me and implanted in me from on high, so that through the influence of divine inspiration I have become greatly excited, and have known neither the place in which I was, nor those who were present, nor myself, nor what I was saying, nor what I was writing. For then I have been conscious of a richness of interpretation, an enjoyment of life, a most penetrating insight, a most manifest energy in all that was to be done, having such an effect on my mind as the clearest ocular demonstration would have on the eyes. This is a true creative ecstasy, strictly parallel to the state in which the mystic performs his mighty works. To let oneself go, be quiet, receptive, appears to be the condition under which such contact with the cosmic life may be obtained. I have noticed that when one paints, one should think of nothing. Everything then comes better, says the young Raphael to Leonardo da Vinci. The superficial self must here acknowledge its own insufficiency, must become the humble servant of a more profound and vital consciousness. The mystics are of the same opinion. Let the will quietly and wisely understand, says Saint Teresa, that it is not by dint of labour on our part that we can converse to any good purpose with God. The best and noblest way in which thou mayst come into this life, says Eckhart, is by keeping silence and letting God work and speak. Where all the powers are withdrawn from their work and images, there is this word spoken. The more thou canst draw in all thy powers, and forget the creature, the nearer art thou to this, and the more receptive. Thus Boehm says to the neophyte, when both thy intellect and will are quiet and passive to the expressions of the eternal word and spirit, and when thy soul is winged up above that which is temporal, the outward senses and the imagination being locked up by holy abstraction, then the eternal hearing, seeing, and speaking will be revealed in thee. Blessed art thou, therefore, if thou canst stand still from self-thinking and self-willing, and canst stop the wheel of thy imagination and senses. Then, the conscious mind being passive, the more divine mind below the threshold, organ of our free creative life, can emerge and present its reports. In the words of an older mystic, the soul, leaving all things and forgetting herself, is immersed in the ocean of divine splendor, and illuminated by the sublime abyss of the unfathomable wisdom. The passivity of contemplation, then, is a necessary preliminary of spiritual energy, an essential clearing of the ground. It withdraws the tide of consciousness from the shores of sense, stops the wheel of the imagination. The soul, says Eckhart again, is created in a place between time and eternity. With its highest powers, it touches eternity. With its lower, time. These, the worlds of being and becoming, are the two stages of reality, which meet in the spirit of man. By cutting us off from the temporal plane, the lower kind of reality, contemplation gives the eternal plane, and the powers which can communicate with that plane, their chance. In the born mystic, these powers are great, and lie very near the normal threshold of consciousness. He has a genius for transcendental, or as he would say, divine, discovering much the same way as his cousins, the born musicians and poets, have achieved musical or poetic discovery. In all three cases, the emergence of these higher powers is mysterious, and not least so to those who experience it. Psychology on the one hand, theology on the other, may offer us diagrams and theories of this proceeding, of the strange oscillations of the developing consciousness, the fitful visitations of the lucidity and creative power over which the self has written or made control, the raptures and griefs of illusion by turns granted and explained. But the secret of genius still eludes us, as the secret of life eludes the biologist. The utmost we can say of such persons is that reality presents itself to them under abnormal conditions and in abnormal terms, and that subject to these conditions and in these terms they are bound to deal with it. Thanks to their peculiar mental makeup, one aspect of the universe is for them focused so sharply that in comparison with it, all other images are blurred, vague, and unreal. Hence the sacrifice which men of genius, mystics, artists, inventors, make of their whole lives to this one object, this one vision of truth, is not self-denial, but rather self-fulfillment. They gather themselves up from the unreal in order to concentrate on the real. The whole personality then absorbs or enters into communion with certain rhythms or harmonies existent in the universe, which the receiving apparatus of other selves cannot take up. Here is the finger of God, a flash of the will that can, exclaims Abt Vogler, as the sounds grow under his hand. The numbers came, says the poet. He knows not how, certainly not by deliberate intellection. So it is with the mystic. Madame Guyon states in her autobiography that when she was composing her works, she would experience a sudden and irresistible inclination to take up her pen, though feeling wholly incapable of literary composition, and not even knowing the subject on which she would be impelled to write. If she resisted this impulse, it was at the cost of the most intense discomfort. She would then begin to write with extraordinary swiftness, words, elaborate arguments, and appropriate quotations coming to her without reflection, and so quickly that one of her longest books was written in 1.5 days. In writing, I saw that I was writing of things which I had never seen, and during the time of this manifestation, I was given light to perceive that I had in me treasures of knowledge and understanding which I did not know that I possessed. Similar statements are made of Saint Teresa, who declared that in writing her books, she was powerless to set down anything but that which her master put into her mind. So Blake said of Milton and Jerusalem, "I have written the poems from immediate dictation, 12 or sometimes 20 or 30 lines at a time, without premeditation and even against my will. The time it has taken in writing was thus rendered non-existent, and an immense poem exists which seems to be the labour of a long life, all produced without labour or study." These are, of course, extreme forms of that strange power of automatic composition, in which words and characters arrive and arrange themselves in defiance of their author's will, of which most poets and novelists possess a trace. Such composition is probably related to the automatic writing of mediums and other sensitives, in which the often disorderly and incoherent subliminal mind seizes upon this channel of expression. The subliminal mind of the great mystic, however, is not disorderly. It is abnormally sensitive, richly endowed and keenly observant, a treasure house, not a lumber room, and becomes in the course of its education a highly disciplined and skilled instrument of knowledge. When therefore its contents emerge and are presented to the normal consciousness in the form of lucidity, auditions, visions, automatic writing, or any other translations of the supersensible into the terms of sensible perception, they cannot be discredited because the worthless unconscious region of feebler natures sometimes manifests itself in the same way. Idiots are often voluble, but many orators are sane. Now, to sum up, what are the chief characteristics which we have found to concern us in this sketch map of the mental life of man? 1. We have divided that life, arbitrarily enough, along the fluctuating line which psychologists call the threshold of his consciousness, into the surface life and the unconscious deeps. 2. In the surface life, though we recognize its essential wholeness, we distinguish three outstanding and ever-present aspects: the trinity and unity of feeling, thought, and will. Amongst these, we were obliged to give the primacy to feeling as the power which set the machinery of thought and will to work. 3. We have seen that the expression of this life takes the two complementary forms of conation, or outgoing action, and cognition, or indwelling knowledge, and that the first, which is dynamic in type, is largely the work of the will stimulated by the emotions, whilst the second, which is passive in type, is the business of the intellect. They answer to the two main aspects which man discerns in the universal life: being and becoming. 4. Neither conation nor cognition, action nor thought, as performed by this surface mind, concerned as it is with natural existence and dominated by spatial conceptions, is able to set up any relations with the absolute or transcendental world. Such action and thought deal wholly with material supplied directly or indirectly by the world of sense. The testimony of the mystics, however, and of all persons possessing an instinct for the absolute, points to the existence of a further faculty, indeed a deeper self, in man. A self which the circumstances of diurnal life usually keep below the threshold of his consciousness, and which thus becomes one of the factors of his subliminal life. This hidden self is the primary agent of mysticism, and lives a substantial life in touch with the real or transcendental world. 5. Certain processes, of which contemplation has been taken as a type, can so alter the state of consciousness as to permit the emergence of this deeper self, which, according as it enters more or less into the consciousness of life, makes man more or less a mystic. The mystic life, therefore, involves the emergence from deep levels of man's transcendental self, its capture of the field of consciousness, and the conversion or rearrangement of his feeling, thought, and will, his character, about this new center of life. We state then, as the conclusion of this chapter, that the object of the mystic's adventure, seen from within, is the apprehension of, or direct communion with, that transcendental reality which we tried in the last section to define from without. Here, as in the fulfillment of the highest earthly love, knowledge and communion are the same thing. We must be one with bliss if we are to be aware of it. That aspect of our being by which we may obtain this communion, that marrow of the soul, as Roosevelt calls it, usually lies below the threshold of our consciousness. But in certain natures of abnormal richness and vitality, and under certain favorable conditions, it may be liberated by various devices, such as contemplation. Once it has emerged, however, it takes up, to help it in the work, aspects of the conscious self. The surface must cooperate with the deeps, and at last merge with those deeps to produce that unification of consciousness upon high levels, which alone can put a term to man's unrest. The heart that longs for the all, the mind that conceives it, the will that concentrates the whole self upon it, must all be called into play. The self must be surrendered, but it must not be annihilated, as some quietists have supposed. It only dies that it may live again. Supreme success, the permanent assurance of the mystic that we are more verily in heaven than in earth, says the Lady Julian in a passage which anticipates the classification of modern psychology, cometh of the natural love of our soul, and of the clear light of our reason, and of the steadfast mind. But what is the order of precedence which these three activities are to assume in the work which is one? All, as we have seen, must do their part, for we are concerned with the response of man in his wholeness to the overwhelming attraction of God. But which shall predominate? The ultimate nature of the self's experience of reality will depend on the answer she gives to this question. What, here, are the relative values of mind and heart? Which will bring her closest to the thought of God, the real life in which she is bathed? Which, fostered and made dominant, is most likely to put her in harmony with the Absolute? The love of God, which is ever in the heart and often on the lips of the saints, is the passionate desire for this harmony. The malady of thought is its intellectual equivalent. Though we may seem to escape God, we cannot escape some form of this craving, except at the price of utter stagnation. We go back, therefore, to the statement with which this chapter opened, that of the two governing desires which share the prison of the self, we see them now as representing the cravings of the intellect and the emotions for the only end of all quests. The disciplined will, the cognitive power, with all the dormant faculties which it can wake and utilize, can come to the assistance of one of them. Which? The question is a crucial one, for the destiny of the self depends on the partner which the will selects. End of Part 1, Chapter 3.